Have you ever wondered what it would be like to be born into a family so powerful that your father literally holds the keys to heaven and hell? A family so notorious that their very name becomes synonymous with poison, murder, and corruption. Well, meet Lucrezia Borgia, a woman whose life reads like the most scandalous Netflix series you could ever imagine, except every twisted detail actually happened. Picture this. It's the late 1400s, and while most teenage girls are worried about arranged marriages and embroidery, Lucrezia Borgia is navigating papal politics, dodging assassination attempts, and allegedly learning the fine art of poisoning from her own family. By the time she turned 22, she had been married 3 times, widowed once under mysterious circumstances, and had become one of the most feared and fascinating women in Renaissance Italy. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about Lucrezia's story. Everything you think you know about her is probably wrong. The popular image of her as a cold-blooded poisoner who seduced men only to kill them with her infamous poisoned ring. That's mostly legend. The real Lucrezia Borgia was something far more complex and arguably more dangerous than any fictional villain Hollywood could create. What I'm about to reveal in this video will completely shatter everything you believed about one of history's most misunderstood women. We're going to dive deep into the blood-soaked world of Renaissance papal politics, uncover the truth behind the Borgia family's rise to power, and discover how a young woman used her intelligence, beauty, and ruthless pragmatism to survive in a world where one wrong move could mean death. And trust me, by the end of this journey, you'll understand why Lucrezia Borgia's story isn't just about scandal and intrigue. It's about power, survival, and what happens when a brilliant woman finds herself at the center of the most dangerous game ever played. Plus, I'll show you how her story connects to modern power dynamics in ways that will absolutely blow your mind. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how insane the world Lucrezia was born into really was. Imagine waking up one morning in 1492 and discovering that your father has just become the Pope. Not just any Pope, but arguably the most corrupt, power-hungry, and morally bankrupt Pope in the entire history of the Catholic Church. Your father, Rodrigo Borgia, who has now taken the name Pope Alexander VI, has literally bought his way to the throne of St. Peter through bribery, blackmail, and political manipulation that would make modern politicians weep with envy. This is the world 12-year-old Lucrezia Borgia suddenly finds herself thrust into. One day, she's the illegitimate daughter of a Spanish cardinal living in relative obscurity, and the next day, she's literally papal royalty with all the privileges and dangers that come with it. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so her dad became Pope, big deal. But you have to understand something crucial about the papacy in Renaissance Italy. The Pope wasn't just a religious leader. He was the ruler of the Papal States, one of the most powerful political entities in Europe. He commanded armies, controlled vast territories, and wielded influence that could make or break kings and emperors. And Rodrigo Borgia didn't just want to be Pope. He wanted to create a dynasty. He wanted to establish Borgia power that would last for generations. And he was willing to use every tool at his disposal to achieve that goal, including his own children. This is where Lucrezia's story becomes truly fascinating, because she wasn't just a pawn in her father's political games. From an incredibly young age, she demonstrated a sharp intelligence and political acumen that would make her one of the most effective political operators of her time. Let me tell you about her first marriage, because it perfectly illustrates just how ruthless and calculating the Borgia family political machine really was. In 1493, when Lucrezia was just 13 years old, Pope Alexander arranged her marriage to Giovanni Sforza, the Lord of Pesaro. Now, this wasn't a love match. This was pure political strategy. The Sforza family controlled Milan, one of the most powerful city-states in northern Italy. By marrying Lucrezia to Giovanni Sforza, Pope Alexander was securing a crucial alliance that would help protect papal interests in the north. But here's the thing about political marriages in Renaissance Italy. They only lasted as long as they served their purpose. For 3 years, Lucrezia played the role of the dutiful wife. She lived in Pesaro, learned the intricate dance of court politics, and began developing the skills that would later make her such a formidable political player. But behind the scenes, the Borgia family's needs were changing, and Giovanni Sforza was about to discover just how dangerous it could be to marry into the Borgia clan. By 1497, Pope Alexander had decided that his alliance with the Sforzas was no longer beneficial. In fact, the Sforzas had become potential enemies. The Pope needed new allies, and that meant Lucrezia's marriage to Giovanni had to end. But there was a problem. In the Catholic Church, marriage was supposed to be permanent. Divorce wasn't an option. This is where the Borgia family's creativity in solving inconvenient problems really shines through. Pope Alexander decided that the marriage had never been consummated and was therefore invalid. He demanded that Giovanni Sforza publicly admit to impotence, essentially destroying his reputation and masculinity in front of all of Europe. Giovanni, understandably, was not thrilled with this arrangement. He fled Pesaro in the middle of the night, convinced that the Borgias were planning to have him murdered. And honestly, given what happened to other people who crossed the Borgia family, his paranoia was probably justified. But here's where Lucrezia's political intelligence really becomes apparent. Rather than simply being a passive victim in this marital disaster, she actively participated in the annulment proceedings. She testified that the marriage had indeed never been consummated, supporting her father's version of events. Some historians argue that she was simply doing what she was told, but others suggest that she was already learning to use the system to her own advantage. The annulment was granted in 1497, and suddenly 18-year-old Lucrezia Borgia was free to marry again, and Pope Alexander already had the perfect candidate in mind. Alfonso of Aragon was the illegitimate son of the King of Naples, and marrying him to Lucrezia would secure a crucial alliance with the Kingdom of Naples. But this marriage would be different from her first. Alfonso was young, handsome, and by all accounts, Lucrezia actually fell in love with him. For a brief moment, it seemed like Lucrezia might actually get to experience something approaching a normal married life. She and Alfonso were wed in 1498, and for the first time in her life, Lucrezia appeared genuinely happy. She gave birth to a son, Rodrigo, named after her father, and seemed to settle into domestic bliss. But in the world of Renaissance politics, happiness was always temporary, and the Borgia family's needs were constantly evolving. The problem was Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia's older brother, who had become his father's primary instrument of political and military ambition. Cesare was brilliant, ruthless, and absolutely determined to carve out his own territory in central Italy. But his plans required French support, and the French were enemies of the Kingdom of Naples. This put Alfonso of Aragon in an impossible position. As the son of the King of Naples, he was automatically an enemy of France. As long as he was married to Lucrezia, he was a potential threat to Cesare's ambitions, and, by extension, to the entire Borgia political project. In July 1500, Alfonso of Aragon was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica. He was stabbed multiple times, but miraculously survived the assassination attempt. Lucrezia, who was genuinely devoted to her husband, personally nursed him back to health, even going so far as to taste his food to ensure it wasn't poisoned. But Alfonso's recovery was only temporary. A month later, while he was still recovering from his wounds, he was found dead in his bed. The official cause of death was given as complications from his earlier injuries, but everyone in Rome knew the truth. Alfonso had been murdered, almost certainly on the orders of Cesare Borgia. Lucrezia was devastated. For the first time in her life, she had experienced genuine love and happiness, and it had been ripped away from her by her own family's political ambitions. She retreated from public life, refusing to participate in the social events that were so crucial to papal court politics. but her grief was a luxury the Borgia family couldn't afford. Pope Alexander needed Lucrezia back in the political game because he had plans for her that would dwarf her previous two marriages in terms of ambition and scope. The Pope had set his sights on the most prestigious marriage alliance possible for his daughter. He wanted to marry her into the Este family, one of the oldest and most respected noble houses in Italy. The Estes ruled Ferrara, a wealthy and strategically important duchy in northern Italy, and they represented exactly the kind of legitimacy and respectability that the Borgia family desperately needed. But convincing the Estes to accept a Borgia bride wouldn't be easy. The family had a reputation for corruption and violence that made them toxic to many of the established noble houses. Plus, Lucrezia was now a twice-married woman with a complicated past, hardly the ideal candidate for marriage into Italian nobility. This is where Pope Alexander's political genius really becomes apparent. He understood that the Estes might be reluctant to ally themselves with the Borgias, so he made them an offer they literally couldn't refuse. The negotiation process for Lucrezia's third marriage reveals just how sophisticated and ruthless papal diplomacy had become under Alexander's leadership. The Pope offered the Este family massive financial incentives, including a dowry of 100,000 ducats, an enormous sum for the time. He also promised military support for Este territorial ambitions and guaranteed favourable treatment for Este commercial interests throughout the Papal States. But the real masterstroke was Alexander's threat of what would happen if the Estes refused his generous offer. The implication was clear. Families that opposed Borgia interests had a tendency to find themselves facing mysterious accidents, sudden illnesses, and unexpected military disasters. Duke Ercole d'Este, the patriarch of the family, found himself in an impossible position. Accepting the marriage would tie his family's fortunes to the notoriously unstable Borgias, but refusing might result in the kind of papal wrath that could destroy his duchy entirely. After months of delicate negotiation, the marriage contract was finally signed. Lucrezia Borgia would marry Alfonso d'Este, the Duke's eldest son and heir, making her the future Duchess of Ferrara. But as Lucrezia prepared for her third marriage, she had no idea that she was about to enter the most dangerous and transformative period of her entire life. The wedding preparations for Lucrezia's third marriage were unlike anything Renaissance Italy had ever witnessed. Pope Alexander spared absolutely no expense in creating a spectacle that would announce to the world that the Borgias had arrived as legitimate players on the European stage. But beneath all the pageantry and political manoeuvring, something extraordinary was happening to Lucrezia herself. At 21 years old, she was no longer the naive girl who had been shuffled between marriages like a chess piece. The deaths of her previous husbands, the constant political upheavals, and years of navigating the treacherous waters of papal court had transformed her into something remarkable. She had become a master manipulator in her own right, capable of reading political situations with an accuracy that impressed even her cynical father and brother. The journey from Rome to Ferrara in January 1502 was designed to be a triumph, but it nearly became a disaster that would have changed the course of Italian history. Lucrezia travelled with an entourage of over 1,000 people, including nobles, servants, soldiers, and enough baggage to supply a small army. The procession stretched for miles along the winter roads, moving slowly through territories where Borgia enemies lurked behind every hill. What makes this journey so fascinating is that Lucrezia wasn't just passively being delivered to her new husband, like a piece of valuable cargo. She was actively conducting diplomacy along the route, meeting with local rulers, negotiating agreements, and demonstrating the political skills that would soon make her one of the most effective rulers in Italy. In Bologna, she met with Giovanni Bentivoglio, the city's ruler, who had been wavering in his loyalty to the Papal States. By the time their private meeting was over, Bentivoglio had not only reaffirmed his allegiance to Pope Alexander, but had also agreed to provide military support for future Borgia campaigns. How did a 21-year-old woman manage to secure the loyalty of a hardened political survivor like Bentivoglio? The answer lies in understanding just how sophisticated Lucrezia's political education had become. Unlike most noble women of her time, who were trained in domestic arts and religious devotion, Lucrezia had received what amounted to a graduate-level education in realpolitik. She had sat in on papal councils, observed diplomatic negotiations, and learned from masters of political manipulation like her father and brother. But more importantly, she had developed her own unique approach to wielding influence, where Pope Alexander relied on fear and bribery, and Cesare depended on military intimidation. Lucrezia had perfected the art of making people want to help her. She combined genuine charm with razor-sharp intelligence, creating an irresistible combination that allowed her to achieve political objectives without making the kinds of enemies that plagued the rest of her family. The wedding ceremony itself, held in Ferrara's cathedral, was a masterpiece of political theatre. Every detail had been choreographed to send specific messages to the various audiences watching the proceedings. To the common people, it demonstrated the wealth and power of their new duchess. To foreign diplomats, it showed that the Borgias had achieved acceptance among Italy's most prestigious families. To potential enemies, it served as a warning about the consequences of opposing Borgia interests. But the most important audience for this spectacle was Alfonso d'Este himself. The man Lucrezia was marrying was no naive romantic. He was a battle-hardened military commander who had spent years fighting in Italy's endless wars. He was also deeply suspicious of his new bride and her family's motives. Alfonso had agreed to the marriage for political reasons, but he had no intention of allowing himself to be manipulated by Borgia schemes. What happened next would surprise everyone, including Lucrezia and Alfonso themselves. Despite the political nature of their union, despite Alfonso's suspicions and Lucrezia's complicated past, something unexpected began to develop between them. It wasn't the passionate love affair she had experienced with her second husband, but rather a partnership based on mutual respect and shared political intelligence. Alfonso quickly discovered that his new wife was nothing like the Scena describing poised in the rumours that circulated throughout Italy. Instead, he found a woman whose political instincts complemented his own military expertise perfectly. While focused on defending Ferrara's borders and expanding its territory, Lucrezia took charge of internal administration and diplomatic relations. The transformation of Lucrezia from papal pawn to effective ruler didn't happen overnight, but within months of her arrival in Ferrara, she was making decisions that would shape the duchy's future for decades. She reorganized the tax collection system, streamlined the judicial process, and established new trade agreements that dramatically increased Ferrara's wealth. But perhaps most importantly, she began to distance herself from her family's more notorious activities. When Cesare Borgia requested military support for his campaigns in the Romagna, Lucrezia convinced Alfonso to provide only minimal assistance. When Pope Alexander demanded that Ferrara serve as a staging ground for papal armies, she negotiated compromises that satisfied her father while protecting Ferrara's interests. This delicate balancing act required incredible political skill. Lucrezia had to maintain her family ties while establishing her independence, support Borgia interests while protecting her new home, and prove her loyalty to Alfonso while keeping her options open in case the political winds changed direction. The real test of her abilities came in 1503, when Pope Alexander suddenly died under mysterious circumstances. The official cause of death was fever, but rumours immediately began circulating that he had been poisoned, possibly by enemies seeking revenge for years of Borgia crimes. With her father dead and her brother Cesare fighting for his political survival, Lucrezia found herself in an incredibly vulnerable position. Many observers expected her to flee Ferrara and seek refuge with whatever remained of Borgia power. Others predicted that Alfonso would use his father-in-law's death as an excuse to annul his marriage and rid himself of his inconvenient Borgia bride. Instead, something remarkable happened that revealed just how completely Lucrezia had transformed herself from political liability into invaluable asset. Alfonso not only kept his wife, but began relying on her political judgment more than ever. When delegations of nobles arrived to test Ferrara's resolve in the post-Borgia era, it was Lucrezia who received them and convinced them that the duchy remained a formidable power. When neighboring rulers attempted to seize territory they assumed would be undefended, it was Lucrezia's diplomatic network that organized the resistance. The death of Pope Alexander also revealed something fascinating with her notorious about Lucrezia's relationship family. While she had clearly distanced herself from their more extreme activities, she had also learned valuable lessons from their successes and failures. She understood that power without legitimacy was ultimately unsustainable, which is why she had worked so hard to establish genuine popularity among Ferrara's citizens. Unlike her father and brother, who ruled through fear and maintained power through constant vigilance against enemies, Lucrezia built her authority on a foundation of competence and genuine concern for her subjects' welfare. She established hospitals, patronized artists and scholars, and created policies that improved living conditions for common citizens as well as nobles. This approach to governance was revolutionary for its time. Most rulers viewed their subjects as resources to be exploited for military and financial purposes. Lucrezia understood that genuinely popular rulers were much more secure than those who depended solely on force and intimidation, but she hadn't abandoned all of the Borgia family's more pragmatic approaches to problem solving. When diplomatic solutions failed and military action became necessary, Lucrezia proved she could be as ruthless as any of her relatives. The difference was that she used violence strategically rather than impulsively, and she always made sure that her harsh actions served clear political purposes. The years following her father's death also saw Lucrezia develop into one of Renaissance Italy's most sophisticated patrons of arts and learning. She attracted poets, painters, philosophers, and musicians to the Ferrarese court, creating a cultural environment that rivaled Florence and Rome. But this wasn't just about prestige or personal interest. Lucrezia understood that cultural patronage was a form of political investment that would pay dividends for generations. By surrounding herself with brilliant artists and thinkers, she was ensuring that Ferrara would be remembered as more than just another small Italian duchy. She was creating a legacy that would outlast any individual ruler or political alliance. The writers and artists she supported would spread stories of her wisdom and generosity throughout Europe, building a reputation that would protect her interests even when her armies couldn't. This long-term thinking reveals perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Lucrezia's transformation from papal daughter to independent ruler. She had learned to think beyond the immediate political crisis, beyond the next marriage alliance or military campaign, to consider how her actions would affect Ferrara's position decades into the future. The woman who had once been shuffled between marriages as a tool of papal diplomacy had become a master strategist whose influence would but shape Italian politics for years. The most dangerous challenges of her life were still ahead of her, and they would test every skill she had developed during her remarkable journey from Rome to Ferrara. As Lucrezia consolidated her power in Ferrara and established herself as one of Italy's most effective rulers, forces were already moving that would threaten everything she had built. Foreign armies were massing on Italy's borders, old enemies were plotting revenge, and new political crises were emerging that would require all of her intelligence and cunning to survive. The greatest test of Lucrezia's transformation from papal pawn to political mastermind came not from external enemies, but from an unexpected source that would shake the very foundations of everything she had built in Ferrara. In 1505, just 2 years after her father's death, Alfonso d'Este made a decision that would either cement their partnership or destroy it entirely. He announced his intention to leave Ferrara and join the French military campaign in northern Italy, effectively abandoning his duchy at one of the most dangerous moments in its history. To understand why this decision was so catastrophic, you need to realize that Renaissance Italy was essentially a chessboard where powerful foreign monarchs moved their armies like pieces, and Italian city-states were constantly being conquered, destroyed, or absorbed by larger powers. With Alfonso gone, Ferrara would be defended by a skeleton garrison and governed by a woman whose family name was still synonymous with scandal and treachery. Every neighboring ruler would see this as an opportunity to settle old scores or grab valuable territory. Every ambitious condottiero would view Ferrara as easy prey. Every enemy the Borgias had made over the years would finally have their chance for revenge. But Alfonso's decision revealed something crucial about how completely Lucrezia had transformed herself. Instead of panicking or begging her husband to reconsider, she calmly accepted the responsibility and began preparing for what would essentially be a siege of her entire political career. The first challenge came from Venice, whose leaders had been waiting years for an opportunity to expand their territory at Ferrara's expense. The Venetians had never forgotten that Ferrara controlled crucial trade routes along the Po River, routes that could make Venice even wealthier if they could seize control of them. Within weeks of Alfonso's departure, Venetian agents began appearing in Ferrara's outlying territories, offering bribes to local commanders and spreading rumors that the duchy was about to collapse. They promised that anyone who switched sides before the inevitable Venetian conquest would be rewarded with land and titles. A lesser ruler might have responded with desperate military action or frantic diplomatic appeals to distant allies. Lucrezia did something far more sophisticated. She turned the Venetian strategy against itself by launching a counter-intelligence operation that would have impressed her brother Cesare at his most devious. She began feeding false information to known Venetian agents, creating the impression that Ferrara was far weaker than it actually was, while simultaneously preparing defenses that would shock any army foolish enough to attack. She convinced several Venetian spies that key fortifications were undermanned and poorly supplied, while secretly reinforcing those same positions with her most loyal troops. But the masterstroke was how she handled the bribery attempts. Instead of simply rejecting Venetian offers, she pretended to consider them, drawing out the negotiations while gathering intelligence about Venetian military plans and identifying which of her own commanders might be susceptible to future corruption. By the time Venice realized they were being played, Lucrezia had not only neutralized their immediate threat, but had also established an intelligence network that would serve Ferrara's interests for years to come. The Venetians found themselves facing a duchy that was far better prepared than they had expected, defended by commanders whose loyalty had been tested and proven, and ruled by a woman who clearly inherited more than just her father's political instincts. The second major crisis came from an even more dangerous source, the papacy itself. Pope Julius II, who had succeeded Alexander, was determined to erase every trace of Borgia influence from Italian politics. He viewed Lucrezia not just as a political rival, but as a living reminder of his predecessor's corruption and moral failures. Julius began pressuring other Italian rulers to isolate Ferrara diplomatically, arguing that any alliance with a Borgia was tantamount to supporting the worst excesses of the previous papal regime. He offered military support to anyone willing to move against Ferrara, and he made it clear that rulers who continued to maintain friendly relations with Lucrezia would face papal displeasure. This was perhaps the most dangerous threat Lucrezia had ever faced, because it attacked the very foundation of her political transformation she had accomplished in Ferrara Dep. Everything ended on her ability to distance herself from her family's reputation while still benefiting from the political skills she had learned from them. If Julius succeeded in branding her as irredeemably tainted by Borgia crimes, all of her careful work would be destroyed. Her response demonstrated just how sophisticated her understanding of Renaissance politics had become. Instead of defending her family's record or attempting to justify past Borgia actions, she chose to reframe the entire conversation in terms that put Pope Julius on the defensive. She began circulating carefully crafted letters throughout Italy, arguing that rulers who allowed the Pope to dictate their domestic political arrangements were essentially surrendering their sovereignty to papal authority. She pointed out that if Julius could force them to abandon alliances with Ferrara today, he could force them to abandon any alliance tomorrow if it served papal interests. This was brilliant political jiu-jitsu. By Julius, as a broader framing her conflict with question about Italian independence from papal interference, Lucrezia transformed herself from an isolated Borgia remnant into a symbol domination, of resistance against foreign rulers, who might have been willing to sacrifice her to curry papal favour, suddenly found themselves defending their own autonomy. The strategy worked because it tapped into deep-seated resentments that Italian nobles harboured against papal authority under Alexander's heavy political interference. Many of them had chanted tactics, but they also feared setting precedents that would allow future popes to meddle in their internal affairs. But Lucrezia's most impressive political victory during this period came not from outmanoeuvring enemies, but from her handling of a succession crisis that threatened to tear Ferrara apart from 1506, Alfonso within. In's younger brother Ippolito d'Este returned from France with ambitious plans and a group of supporters who questioned whether Alfonso was providing adequate leadership for the duchy. Ippolito was everything Alfonso was not: charming, cultured, and politically sophisticated in ways that impressed foreign diplomats and Italian nobles. He had spent years at the French court learning the subtle arts of Renaissance diplomacy, and he returned to Ferrara convinced that he could rule the duchy more effectively than his militarily minded older brother. The situation was incredibly delicate. If Lucrezia supported her husband against his brother, she risked being seen as an outsider, interfering in Este family affairs. If she remained neutral, she might find herself married to a deposed ruler with no political future. If she supported Ippolito, she would be betraying the man who had accepted her when the rest of Italy viewed her as political poison. What she did instead reveals the full extent of her political genius. She engineered a solution that strengthened her position while eliminating the threat to Alfonso's rule without making Ippolito into a permanent enemy. Lucrezia convinced Alfonso to offer his brother a position that would satisfy Ippolito's ambitions while removing him from Ferrara's internal politics. She suggested that Ippolito be appointed as the duchy's permanent ambassador to France, a role that would utilize his diplomatic skills while keeping him away from potential supporters in Ferrara. But the brilliant part of her plan was how she sold it to all parties involved. To Alfonso, she presented it as a way to neutralize a threat while gaining valuable intelligence about French intentions. To Ippolito, she framed it as recognition of his superior diplomatic abilities and an opportunity to build his own power base in the French court. To potential supporters of both brothers, she made it seem like a wise compromise that avoided civil conflict. The plan succeeded because Lucrezia had learned to think several moves ahead, like a chess master who can see how each decision will affect future possibilities. By removing Ippolito from Ferrara without humiliating him, she eliminated an immediate threat while creating a potential ally in the French court. If political circumstances changed and Ferrara needed French support, Ippolito would be perfectly positioned to provide it. This episode also revealed something fascinating about how Lucrezia had learned to use her reputation as both weapon and shield. When she wanted to intimidate enemies, she could invoke the fear that still surrounded the Borgia name. When she needed to build trust, she could point to her transformation into a responsible ruler who'd her family's more had abandoned extreme tactics. But perhaps most importantly, her handling of the succession crisis demonstrated that she had mastered the art of turning potential disasters into opportunities for consolidating power. Each challenge she faced became a chance to prove her indispensability to Ferrara's survival and prosperity. By 1507, 5 years after her arrival in Ferrara, Lucrezia had achieved something that would have seemed impossible when she first left Rome as a twice-widowed political exile. She had become the real power behind the Este throne, the person that foreign diplomats sought out when they wanted to influence Ferrara's policies, and the ruler that neighbouring states respected and feared in equal measure. Her court had become a destination for artists, poets, and intellectuals from across Europe. Her administrative reforms had made Ferrara wealthier and more efficient than it had ever been. Her diplomatic network extended from Paris to Naples, giving her access to information and influence that rivaled much larger states. But most remarkably, she had accomplished all of this while gradually rehabilitating the Borgia name itself. People began to speak of her not as Pope Alexander's scandalous daughter, but as the brilliant duchess who had transformed Ferrara into one of Italy's most successful city-states. Yet even as Lucrezia reached the height of her power and influence, new storms were gathering on the horizon that would test every skill she had developed during her remarkable transformation. The political landscape of Italy was about to shift in ways that would threaten not just Ferrara, but the entire system of city-states that had dominated the peninsula for centuries. Foreign armies larger than any Italy had seen were massing beyond the Alps. New alliances were forming that would redraw the map of Europe. Anso determined to crush Italian independence that it included France, Spain, and the Papal States all united against Venice. Now, you might be wondering what this has to do with Lucrezia, but here's the thing about Renaissance politics that most people don't understand. When superpowers start reshaping entire regions, smaller states don't get to sit on the sidelines. They either choose a side, or they get crushed by whichever side wins. And Ferrara, despite all of Lucrezia's careful diplomacy, was about to be forced into the most dangerous political decision of its existence. The League's primary target was Venice, but everyone knew that once the powers had finished carving up Venetian territory, they would turn their attention to the smaller Italian states. Ferrara controlled strategic territory that both France and Spain coveted, and its wealth made it an attractive prize for any conquering army. Alfonso d'Este returned from his French campaigns just in time to face this impossible choice. He could join the League and risk being absorbed by his more powerful allies, or he could oppose it and face certain destruction. But Lucrezia saw a third option that no one else had considered, one that would require the most audacious diplomatic gamble of her career. She proposed that Ferrara play both sides. The plan was incredibly risky. Lucrezia would secretly negotiate with Venice, offering limited support and intelligence about League military plans. Meanwhile, Alfonso would publicly maintain Ferrara's membership in the League, while privately ensuring that his military contributions were minimal and strategically useless. To understand just how dangerous this strategy was, you need to realize that getting caught would mean immediate invasion by France, Spain, and the Papal States simultaneously. Ferrara would be wiped off the map, its rulers executed as traitors, and its territory divided among the League members. But Lucrezia had spent years building the intelligence network and diplomatic relationships that made such a complex deception possible. She had agents in French camps, Spanish courts, and even the papal bureaucracy. More importantly, she had developed a reputation for reliability that made her information valuable to all parties involved. The execution of this double game reveals just how sophisticated Lucrezia's political thinking had become. She didn't just feed false information to the League while helping Venice. Instead, she provided accurate intelligence to both sides, but she carefully controlled the timing of what each side learned. For example, she would warn Venice about planned League attacks, but only after giving the Venetians enough time to prepare defences, not enough time to launch preemptive strikes. She would inform League commanders about Venetian troop movements, but only after those movements had already been completed and were no longer strategically useful. This approach allowed her to maintain credibility with both sides, while ensuring that neither gained a decisive advantage that might end the war quickly. As long as the conflict continued, Ferrara remained valuable to all parties and relatively safe from direct attack. But the most brilliant aspect of her strategy was how she used the war to strengthen Ferrara's long-term position. While other Italian states were exhausting themselves through direct military participation, Lucrezia was using the chaos to expand Ferrara's trade networks, recruit talented refugees from war-torn territories, and acquire valuable intelligence about the military capabilities of all major European powers. The success of this strategy became apparent in 1509, when the League achieved its primary objective of defeating Venice at the Battle of Agnadello. Venetian forces were crushed, their territories occupied, and their political influence seemingly destroyed forever. Most observers expected the victorious League members to immediately begin fighting among themselves for the spoils. Instead, something unexpected happened. The French and Spanish armies, exhausted by constant warfare, began looking for ways to reduce their military commitments in Italy. The Pope, having achieved his goal of humbling Venice, started worrying about the growing French presence in northern Italy, and Venice, desperate to recover its losses, began seeking new allies among the smaller Italian states. Lucrezia had anticipated exactly this scenario. While other rulers scrambled to adjust to the rapidly changing political landscape, she was already implementing plans she had developed months earlier. She had prepared Ferrara to serve as a neutral meeting ground where exhausted enemies could negotiate truces, as a safe haven for refugees with valuable skills, and as a reliable partner for any power seeking to balance against their former allies. The transformation was remarkable. In less than 2 years, Ferrara went from being a potential target of the great powers to being an essential player in Italian politics. Foreign diplomats who had once dismissed Alfonso and Lucrezia as minor provincial rulers now sought audiences in their court. Military commanders who had planned to occupy Ferrarese territory now negotiated for permission to march through it peacefully. But Lucrezia's greatest triumph during this period wasn't military or diplomatic, it was cultural. While other Italian courts were being disrupted by war and political upheaval, Ferrara became a haven for artists, scholars, and intellectuals fleeing from less stable regions. The poet Ludovico Ariosto found refuge in Ferrara during this period and began working on his masterpiece, Orlando Furioso, under Lucrezia's patronage. The painter Dosa Dossi created some of his most celebrated works for the Ferrarese court. Scholars fleeing from war-torn universities brought ancient manuscripts and new ideas that made Ferrara one of the intellectual centers of Renaissance Europe. This cultural flowering wasn't just about prestige. Lucrezia understood that artistic and intellectual achievements created a kind of soft power that military victories couldn't match. A court famous for its cultural sophistication attracted talented individuals who brought economic opportunities, technological innovations, and international connections that benefited the entire duchy. By 1510, foreign visitors to Ferrara were describing it not as a small Italian city-state struggling to survive among larger powers, but as a sophisticated European capital whose influence extended far beyond its geographical boundaries. Lucrezia had successfully transformed her duchy from a political liability into a cultural and diplomatic asset. The personal cost of these achievements was enormous. Lucrezia was now 30 years old, and the constant stress of managing such complex political relationships, while maintaining her cultural patronage and administrative duties, had taken a visible toll. Contemporary accounts describe her as increasingly thin and pale, often working late into the night on correspondence and diplomatic preparations. Her relationship with Alfonso had evolved into something unique in Renaissance politics, a true partnership between equals. He handled military affairs and territorial defense, while she managed diplomacy and internal administration. They consulted each other on major decisions, but each had clear authority in their respective spheres. This division of responsibilities worked because both had developed deep respect for the other's expertise. Alfonso had learned to trust Lucrezia's political instincts even when her strategies seemed counterintuitive. Lucrezia had come to appreciate Alfonso's military judgment and his understanding of the practical limitations that constrained their diplomatic options. But their partnership faced its greatest test in 1511. When Pope Julius II announced the formation of the Holy League, a new alliance designed to drive the French out of Italy entirely. The League included Spain, Venice, England, and the Papal States, creating a coalition powerful enough to challenge French dominance in northern Italy. The problem for Ferrara was that Alfonso had spent years building relationships with French commanders and had received significant military support from France during recent campaigns. Abandoning the French alliance would mean losing crucial military backing at a time when Ferrara's enemies were growing stronger. But opposing the Pope directly would invite immediate invasion by papal armies. Lucrezia proposed a solution so audacious that Alfonso initially refused to consider it. She wanted to negotiate secretly with Pope Julius, offering to betray French military plans in exchange for papal protection and territorial guarantees. But she didn't want to simply switch sides. Instead, she proposed that Ferrara serve as a double agent, providing information to both the French and the Holy League, while secretly working to prevent either side from achieving total victory. The strategy required Lucrezia to personally meet with papal representatives, a dangerous proposition, given Julius's known hatred for everything connected to the Borgia name. But she had concluded that her reputation had been sufficiently rehabilitated to make such negotiations possible, and that the Pope's practical need for reliable intelligence would overcome his personal animosity. The secret negotiations took place in a monastery outside Bologna, with Lucrezia travelling in disguise and using false credentials to avoid detection by French agents. The meeting reveals just how completely she had mastered the art of Renaissance diplomacy. Instead of approaching Pope Julius as a supplicant seeking forgiveness for her family's crimes, she presented herself as a fellow ruler offering a mutually beneficial alliance. She didn't apologize for past Borgia actions or attempt to justify her father's policies. Instead, she focused entirely on what Ferrara could offer the Holy League and what she expected in return. Her negotiating position was stronger than anyone had anticipated. Ferrara's location made it an ideal base for operations against French positions in northern Italy. Lucrezia's intelligence network provided access to information about French military plans that the Holy League desperately needed, and her reputation for keeping agreements meant that any promises she made would be more reliable than commitments from rulers with less established track records. Pope Julius found himself in the unexpected position of negoti, but voting with a woman he had planned to destroy now offered capabilities that his military commanders insisted were essential for victory against the French. His personal hatred for the Borgia family conflicted with his practical need for Ferrara's cooperation. The agreement they reached was a masterpiece of diplomatic complexity. Ferrara would provide intelligence about French military activities while maintaining the appearance of continued alliance with France. In exchange, the Holy League would guarantee Ferrara's territorial integrity and provide military support if Alfonso's deception was discovered by French commanders. But the most remarkable aspect of the agreement was a secret clause that revealed just how completely Lucrezia had transformed her political position. Pope Julius agreed that if the Holy League achieved victory over the French, Lucrezia would be formally recognized as Duchess of Ferrara in her own right, not merely as Alfonso's consort. This recognition would make her one of the few women in Renaissance Europe to hold sovereign authority independent of their husbands or fathers. It represented the ultimate vindication of her transformation from papal pawn to independent political actor. The implementation of this new strategy required Lucrezia to maintain even more complex deceptions than she had managed during the League of Cambrai period. She had to convince French commanders that Ferrara remained a reliable ally while secretly providing their battle plans to Holy League forces. She had to reassure Alfonso that her negotiations with Pope Julius didn't represent a betrayal of their partnership, while concealing the full extent of her private agreements with papal representatives. Most challenging of all, she had to prepare for the possibility that her deceptions might be discovered by either side. French retribution would mean immediate invasion and the destruction of everything she had built in Ferrara. Papal displeasure would result in excommunication and political isolation that would make future diplomacy impossible. The pressure was so intense that Lucrezia began suffering from what contemporary accounts describe as severe headaches and periods of exhaustion that forced her to cancel public appearances. Her personal physician prescribed rest and withdrawal from political activities, advice that she ignored completely. She couldn't afford to reduce her involvement in Ferrara's diplomatic and administrative affairs because the political situation was changing so rapidly that decisions delayed by even a few days could have catastrophic consequences. French and Holy League armies were maneuvering for position throughout northern Italy, and commanders on both sides were demanding immediate answers, two requests that could determine Ferrara's fate. The crisis reached its peak in early 1512, when French forces suffered a series of devastating defeats that left their position in Italy almost hopeless. King Louis XII began withdrawing his remaining armies toward France, abandoning Italian allies who had supported French interests for over a decade. Alfonso found himself in an impossible position. If he retreated with the French forces, he would be abandoning his duchy to Holy League occupation. If he remained in Ferrara, he risked being captured by advancing papal armies and executed as a French collaborator. Lucrezia's response to this crisis demonstrates the full extent of her political transformation. Instead of panicking or seeking refuge with whatever remained of French power, she took personal command of Ferrara's defense, while simultaneously negotiating the terms of Alfonso's surrender to Holy League forces. Her plan was breathtakingly audacious. She would publicly assume full responsibility for Ferrara's alliance with France, claiming that she had manipulated Alfonso into supporting French interests against his better judgment. This would allow Alfonso to surrender with honor while providing Pope Julius with a Borgia scapegoat to blame for Ferrari's resistance to papal authority. But privately, she was gambling that her secret agreements with papal representatives would protect her from the consequences of this public admission. She believed that Pope Julius needed her intelligence capabilities and administrative skills more than he needed. Revenge Ball succeeded against the Borgia family. The game, but barely. When Holy League forces occupied Ferrara in March 1512, Lucrezia was placed under house arrest, while papal investigators examined her role in recent French military activities. For 3 weeks, her fate hung in the balance as Pope Julius decided whether to treat her as a valuable asset or a dangerous enemy who needed to be eliminated. The decision ultimately came down to practical politics rather than personal animosity. Papal administrators who attempted to govern Ferrara without Lucrezia's cooperation discovered that the duchy's complex administrative systems were impossible to operate effectively. Tax collection collapsed, diplomatic correspondence went unanswered, and local nobles began questioning papal authority. More importantly, Lucrezia's intelligence network proved to be the Holy League's most valuable source of information about remaining French activities in northern Italy. Her agents provided detailed reports about French troop movements, supply problems, and morale issues that allowed Holy League commanders to anticipate and counter every French strategic initiative. Pope Julius found himself forced to choose between satisfying his personal desire for revenge against the Borgia family and maintaining the military advantages that Lucrezia's cooperation provided. His decision to release her from house arrest and restore her administrative authority represented one of the most significant political victories of her career. But the most remarkable aspect of her survival during this crisis was how she used it to further strengthen her position in Ferrara. By publicly accepting responsibility for policies that had actually been jointly decided by her and Alfonso, she had demonstrated a level of loyalty and courage that impressed even her harshest critics. When Alfonso returned to Ferrara after negotiating his own reconciliation with Pope Julius, he found that Lucrezia's reputation among their subjects had been enhanced rather than damaged by recent events. The people of Ferrara had watched their duchess risk execution to protect their duke, and they responded with a level of popular support that made her position more secure than ever. The crisis had also revealed the full extent of Lucrezia's intelligence capabilities to Holy League leaders. making her an indispensable asset for future political and military planning. Foreign diplomats who had once viewed her as a useful but expendable ally now treated her as an essential partner whose cooperation was crucial for their own success. By the end of 1512, Lucrezia had achieved something that would have seemed impossible when she first arrived in Ferrara as a twice-widowed political exile. She had not only survived the most dangerous political crisis of her career, but had emerged from it stronger and more influential than ever before. The woman who had once been manipulated by her father's political schemes had become a master manipulator in her own right. The papal daughter, who had been shuffled between marriages as a diplomatic tool, had transformed herself into one of Renaissance Italy's most effective independent rulers. But even as Lucrezia celebrated her political survival and growing influence, new challenges were emerging that would test every skill she had developed during her remarkable transformation. The European political landscape was shifting in ways that would threaten not just individual rulers like herself, but the entire system of Italian city-states that had dominated the peninsula for centuries. The real test of whether Lucrezia Borgia had truly mastered the deadly game of Renaissance politics was still to come, and it would require her to risk everything she had built in one final, desperate gamble for survival. The challenge that define the rest of Lucrezia's life came from an unexpected source: her own success. By 1513, she had become so effective at managing Ferrara's affairs that other Italian rulers began to see her as a threat to the traditional order of Renaissance politics. A woman who wielded genuine political power, rather than simply serving as a conduit for male authority, represented something genuinely revolutionary in a world where female rulers were expected to be temporary placeholders at best. The first sign of this backlash came from Florence, where the Medici family had recently returned to power after years of Republican government. Giovanni de' Medici, who would soon become Pope Leo X, began circulating letters among Italian nobles arguing that Lucrezia's influence over Ferrara represented a dangerous precedent that could destabilize the entire peninsula's political structure. His argument was clever and dangerous. He didn't attack Lucrezia personally or rehash old scandals about her family's past. Instead, he framed her success as a threat to legitimate male authority throughout Italy. If the Duchess of Ferrara could effectively rule a major duchy, what would prevent other noble women from demanding similar authority? What would happen to the carefully constructed marriage alliances that held the Italian political system together if wives began acting as independent political agents rather than obedient representatives of their husbands' interests? This line of attack was particularly insidious because it didn't require any evidence of wrongdoing on Lucrezia's part. Her very competence as a ruler became evidence of the threat she represented. The more effectively she governed Ferrara, the more dangerous other nobles considered her example. The campaign against her gained momentum when several prominent marriages ended in divorce or annulment during 1513 and 1514. In each case, the wives had cited Lucrezia's example as proof that women could successfully manage political and economic affairs independently. These examples were used to argue that her influence was already undermining the stability of noble marriages throughout northern Italy. Lucrezia's response to this attack reveals just how sophisticated her understanding of Renaissance politics had become. Instead of defending her right to rule or arguing for female political equality, she chose to reframe the entire debate in terms that put her critics on the defensive. She began circulating her own letters, arguing that rulers who felt threatened by competent women were revealing their own inadequacies as leaders. Real strength, she suggested, came from surrounding yourself with capable advisors and partners, regardless of their gender. Leaders who needed to suppress female intelligence and initiative were demonstrating that they lacked confidence in their own abilities. This counterattack was brilliantly designed because it forced her male critics to choose between appearing weak or abandoning their attacks on her authority. Any nobleman who continued to argue that women couldn't be trusted with political responsibility would implicitly be admitting that he felt threatened by female competence. The strategy worked because it tapped into the intense pride and competitive nature that drove Renaissance political culture. Italian nobles were obsessed with demonstrating their superiority over their rivals, and Lucrezia had managed to make opposition to her authority seem like an admission of weakness. But the most impressive aspect of her campaign was how she used it to build alliances with other powerful women throughout Europe. She began corresponding with figures like Margaret of Austria, who served as regent of the Netherlands, and Louise of Savoy, who would later become regent of France. These relationships created an informal network of female rulers who could provide mutual support and protection against similar attacks. The network proved its value in 1515, when King Francis I of France invaded Italy with the largest army that had crossed the Alps in decades. The French victory at the Battle of Marignano destroyed the Holy League and restored French dominance over northern Italy, creating exactly the kind of political upheaval that had previously threatened Ferrara's survival. But this time, Lucrezia was prepared. Her correspondence with Louise of Savoy, King Francis's mother and closest advisor, had already established the groundwork for Ferrara's cooperation with the new French regime. While other Italian rulers scrambled to adjust their policies to accommodate French demands, Lucrezia was already implementing agreements that had been negotiated months earlier. The transition was so smooth that French commanders commented on Ferrara's exceptional efficiency in adapting to the new political reality. Other Italian courts took weeks or months to establish working relationships with French administrators. Ferrara's government was functioning normally within days of the French occupation. This efficiency wasn't accidental. Lucrezia had spent years developing administrative systems that could function effectively regardless of which foreign power dominated Italian politics. Her bureaucracy was staffed with professionals who understood that their loyalty was to Ferrara's long-term interests, rather than to any particular alliance or ideology. The approach paid enormous dividends when King Francis began redistributing Italian territories among his supporters. Rulers who had resisted French authority found their lands confiscated and given to French nobles. Rulers who had collaborated too enthusiastically with previous anti-French alliances faced punishment and humiliation. But Ferrara was not only confirmed in its territorial holdings, but was actually granted additional lands confiscated from less adaptable neighbours. Lucrezia's careful management of the French authorities' transition had convinced that Ferrara could be trusted with expanded responsibilities. The territorial expansion created new challenges that tested every aspect of Lucrezia's administrative abilities. The newly acquired lands included populations with different languages, customs, and legal traditions. Integrating these diverse territories into Ferrara's existing governmental structure required diplomatic skills that went far beyond traditional military conquest. Lucrezia's solution was to create a federal system that allowed local communities to maintain their traditional practices while accepting Ferrara's authority in matters of taxation, defense, and foreign relations. This approach was revolutionary for its time, when most rulers imposed uniform legal and cultural standards throughout their territories, regardless of local preferences. The policy succeeded because it addressed the real concerns of conquered populations, while serving Ferrara's strategic interests. Local leaders who might have organized resistance against a more heavy-handed occupation instead became partners in maintaining stability and prosperity. Tax collection proceeded smoothly because local administrators understood and respected the systems they were operating. But perhaps most importantly, the federal approach created a model that other Italian rulers began copying when they faced similar challenges. Lucrezia's administrative innovations were spreading throughout northern Italy, increasing her influence even beyond Ferrara's formal borders. The success of her territorial expansion also revealed something remarkable about how completely she had transformed Ferrara's international reputation. When she first arrived in the duchy as a young bride fleeing Borgia scandals, other rulers viewed Ferrara as a potential liability whose association could damage their own reputations. Now, foreign diplomats actively sought opportunities to study Ferrari's administrative methods. University scholars travelled from across Europe to observe her court's operations. Even rulers who disagreed with her policies acknowledged that she had created one of the most efficient and stable governments in Italy. This recognition became crucial in 1516, when Pope Leo X launched a new campaign designed to reassert papal authority over territories that had been lost during previous conflicts. The Pope's target wasn't just military reconquest, but cultural and intellectual dominance as well. He wanted to demonstrate that Rome, not secular courts like Ferrara, represented the pinnacle of Renaissance civilization. The competition took the form of elaborate cultural projects designed to attract the most talented artists, writers, and scholars in Europe. Pope Leo commissioned massive architectural projects, funded expensive artistic competitions, and offered generous patronage to anyone willing to abandon secular courts for papal service. For most Italian rulers, competing with papal resources would have been impossible. The Catholic Church's wealth dwarfed the treasuries of individual duchies, and Rome's prestige as the centre of Christianity gave it advantages that secular courts couldn't match. But Lucrezia had spent years developing exactly the kind of cultural network that allowed her to compete effectively with papal patronage. The artists and intellectuals she had supported weren't just employees who could be bought by higher bidders. They were partners in creating a distinctive Ferrarese culture that represented genuine innovation rather than mere imitation of classical models. The poet Ludovico Ariosto chose to remain in Ferrara despite receiving lucrative offers from the papal court. His loyalty wasn't just personal affection for Lucrezia, but genuine belief that Ferrara provided a more creative environment for his work. The freedom to explore controversial themes and experimental techniques made Ferrara more attractive than Rome's magnificent but restrictive patronage. Similar choices by other prominent cultural figures demonstrated that Lucrezia had succeeded in creating something that money alone couldn't purchase, a reputation for intellectual freedom and artistic innovation that attracted talent regardless of financial incentives. The cultural competition with Pope Leo also revealed how skillfully Lucrezia had learned to use soft power to achieve political objectives. While the Pope was spending enormous sums on projects designed to impress foreign visitors, she was investing in educational and cultural initiatives that strengthened Ferrara's long-term position. She established new schools that trained administrators, diplomats, and military officers, not just for Ferrari's service, but for careers throughout Italy. Graduates of these institutions carried Ferrari's influence into courts across the peninsula, creating networks of loyalty and cooperation that served the duchy's interests for generations. The printing press, still a relatively new technology, became another tool for extending Ferrari's cultural influence. Lucrezia sponsored the publication of works by court scholars and poets, ensuring that Ferrari's intellectual achievements reached audiences throughout Europe. These books carried subtle political messages that enhanced Ferrara's reputation while promoting ideas that served the duchy's strategic interests. The success of these cultural initiatives created a virtuous cycle that strengthened every aspect of Ferrara's position. International recognition of the duchy's intellectual achievements attracted more talented individuals, which enhanced its cultural reputation, which increased its political influence, which provided resources for further cultural investment. By 1517, foreign observers were describing Ferrara not as a small Italian duchy struggling to survive among larger powers, but as one of Europe's most sophisticated and influential cultural centres. Lucrezia had succeeded in transforming her domain from a political liability into a genuinely significant player in European affairs. But the personal cost of these achievements continued to mount. Contemporary accounts describe Lucrezia as increasingly frail, often unable to participate in the elaborate court ceremonies that were essential to maintaining her political relationships. The constant stress of managing complex diplomatic negotiations while overseeing cultural projects and administrative reforms had taken a visible toll on her health. Her relationship with Alfonso had evolved into something that transcended traditional marriage categories. They functioned more like co-rulers of an independent state than like husband and wife in the conventional sense. Each had clear spheres of authority and responsibility, but major decisions were made jointly after extensive consultation. This partnership had become so effective that foreign diplomats often found it impossible to determine which spouse was actually making crucial policy decisions. Letters from Ferrarese ambassadors would reference discussions with their excellencies without specifying whether particular ideas originated with Alfonso or Lucrezia. The ambiguity was intentional and strategic. By making their decision-making process opaque to outside observers, Alfonso and Lucrezia made it more difficult for foreign powers to manipulate Ferrare's policies through targeted pressure on individual family members. But the partnership faced new strains in 1518, when Alfonso began suffering from the recurring fevers that had plagued him since his military campaigns in France. Contemporary medical knowledge provided no effective treatments for his condition, and there were periods when he was too ill to participate in governmental affairs at all. During these episodes, Lucrezia effectively became Ferrara's sole ruler, making decisions that would normally require consultation with her husband. The transitions were handled so smoothly that many foreign observers didn't realize that Alfonso was incapacitated until long after his recovery. This seamless assumption of expanded authority demonstrated just how completely Lucrezia had mastered the art of Renaissance statecraft. She didn't use Alfonso's illness as an opportunity to seize power or advance personal agendas. Instead, she maintained continuity in Ferrare's policies while preparing for his eventual recovery and return to active governance. The restraint she showed during these periods actually strengthened her long-term position because it proved to potential critics that she could be trusted with expanded authority without becoming a threat to legitimate male leadership. When Alfonso recovered, he found that Lucrezia had not only maintained the duchy's stability, but had actually strengthened its position through careful diplomatic and administrative work. Their partnership became a model that other noble couples began studying and imitating. The traditional Renaissance marriage, based on clear hierarchies and separate spheres of activity, was giving way to more collaborative arrangements that recognized the political value of female intelligence and initiative. But this evolution in noble marriage patterns also created new enemies for Lucrezia. Conservative religious leaders began arguing that her influence over Alfonso represented a dangerous subversion of natural male authority. They claimed that allowing women to participate equally in political decision-making violated divine law and threatened the stability of Christian society. The attacks were particularly dangerous because they came from sources that couldn't be countered through traditional diplomatic means. Lucrezia could negotiate with hostile nobles or foreign rulers, but she couldn't directly challenge religious authorities without risking excommunication and political isolation. Her response revealed yet another dimension of her political sophistication. Instead of confronting religious critics directly, she began patronizing theological scholars who could provide intellectual justification for female political participation. These scholars produced treatises arguing that competent governance was a Christian duty that transcended gender boundaries, and that rulers who ignored valuable advice because of their advisor's gender were violating their obligations to their subjects. The theological campaign was subtle but effective. By framing female political participation as a religious obligation rather than a challenge to traditional authority, Lucrezia's supporters made it difficult for conservative critics to maintain their opposition without appearing to advocate for incompetent governance. The strategy also demonstrated how completely she had learned to think in terms of long-term cultural change rather than immediate political advantage. The theological arguments her scholars developed would influence European thinking about gender and political authority for centuries, extending her impact far beyond her own lifetime or the borders of her duchy. By 1519, 20 years after her first arrival in Ferrara as a young bride fleeing family scandals, Lucrezia had achieved something that would have seemed impossible to contemporary observers. She had not only rehabilitated the Borgia name, but had transformed herself into one of Renaissance Europe's most respected and influential rulers. Her court had become a destination for diplomats, scholars, and artists from across the continent. Her administrative innovations were being copied by rulers throughout Italy. Her cultural patronage had produced works of art and literature that would influence European civilization for generations. But perhaps most remarkably, she had accomplished all of this while gradually transforming European attitudes about female political authority. The woman who had once been dismissed as a papal pawn had become proof that gender need not limit political effectiveness. Yet even as Lucrezia reached the pinnacle of her influence and achievement, forces were gathering that would present her with the greatest challenge of her entire career. The Protestant Reformation was beginning to reshape European religious and political life in ways that threatened the entire system of Italian city-states. New military technologies were making traditional fortifications obsolete. Rising nation-states were developing resources that dwarfed the capabilities of even the most successful Renaissance duchies. The world that had allowed Lucrezia to build her remarkable career was about to change in fundamental ways, and her response to these challenges would determine not just her own fate, but the future of everything she had created in Ferrara. The ultimate test of her transformation from papal daughter to Renaissance master was still ahead, and it would require every skill she had developed during her extraordinary journey from Rome to political. The Protestant Reformation exploded across Europe like wildfire, and suddenly every Catholic ruler found themselves facing an existential crisis that made their previous political challenges look like children's games. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to that church door in Wittenberg, he wasn't just challenging papal authority. He was unleashing forces that would tear apart the entire fabric of European civilization. And Lucrezia Borgia was about to discover that all her diplomatic brilliance might not be enough to save everything she had built. Picture this. It's 1520, and reports are flooding into Ferrara about entire regions abandoning Catholicism overnight. German princes are seizing church properties, French nobles are questioning papal legitimacy, and even in Italy, whispers of reform are spreading through universities and monasteries. For a woman whose entire political identity had been built on navigating Catholic power structures, this represented a threat more dangerous than any army she had ever faced. The immediate crisis came from an unexpected direction. Several of Lucrezia's most trusted advisors began privately expressing sympathy for Protestant ideas, not because they wanted religious reform, but because they saw an opportunity to reduce papal interference in Ferrarese affairs. These were men who had worked closely with her for years, who understood the delicate balance she had maintained between various Catholic powers, and they were suddenly suggesting that Ferrara might benefit from breaking with Rome entirely. The temptation was enormous. If Ferrara declared independence from papal authority, it could seize valuable church properties within its territory, eliminate the tribute payments that drained its treasury, and free itself from the constant threat of papal military intervention. Other rulers were already calculating similar benefits, and some were beginning to make moves that would have seemed unthinkable just a few years earlier. But Lucrezia understood something that her advisors missed. The Protestant Reformation wasn't just about religion or even politics. It was about the fundamental question of who had the right to determine truth and authority in European society. If traditional hierarchies could be overthrown in religious matters, what would prevent similar upheavals in secular politics? If common people could reject papal authority, what would stop them from rejecting ducal authority as well? Her response to this crisis reveals the full maturity of her political thinking. Instead of making hasty decisions based on short-term advantages, she began preparing Ferrara for what she recognized would be decades of religious and political upheaval. She knew that survival would depend not on choosing the right side in the religious conflict, but on maintaining enough flexibility to adapt as the situation continued to evolve. The strategy she developed was breathtakingly complex. Publicly, Ferrara would remain staunchly Catholic, providing military and financial support for papal efforts to combat Protestant expansion. But privately, she began reaching out to Protestant leaders, establishing communication channels that would allow rapid policy adjustments if the religious balance shifted decisively. At the same time, she started implementing internal reforms designed to address the legitimate grievances that were fueling Protestant success. She established new schools that provided better education for common citizens, reformed tax collection to eliminate the most obvious abuses, and created legal procedures that gave ordinary people more protection against arbitrary noble authority. These reforms served multiple purposes. They reduced the appeal of Protestant alternatives by addressing real problems in Ferrarese society. They demonstrated Lucrezia's commitment to good governance regardless of religious considerations. And they created a foundation of popular support that would be crucial if external pressures forced her to make dramatic policy changes. But the most brilliant aspect of her strategy was how she used the religious crisis to strengthen Ferrara's position relative to other Italian states. While her neighbours were paralysed by the need to choose between Catholic and Protestant alternatives, she was building relationships with both sides that would serve Ferrarese's interests regardless of which faction ultimately prevailed. The execution of this strategy required diplomatic skills that surpassed anything she had demonstrated during previous crises. She had to convince papal officials that Ferrara's loyalty was absolute, while secretly reassuring Protestant contacts that she understood their concerns. She had to maintain the appearance of religious orthodoxy while implementing reforms that addressed Protestant criticisms of Catholic governance. The challenge was intensified by the fact that both sides were actively seeking evidence of betrayal by potential allies. Papal investigators were examining the correspondence and activities of every Catholic ruler for signs of heretical sympathies. Protestant agents were testing the sincerity of rulers who claimed to support reform while maintaining formal Catholic allegiance. One wrong move, one intercepted letter, or compromised meeting would expose Lucrezia to retaliation from whichever side felt betrayed. The consequences could range from excommunication and political isolation to military invasion and personal execution. The pressure was so intense that she began suffering from what contemporary accounts describe as severe stomach ailments that left her bedridden for days at a time. Her personal physician prescribed a regimen of rest and reduced activity that would have been impossible to follow given the demands of managing Ferrara during such a turbulent period. Instead, she developed new methods of conducting business that allowed her to maintain her political effectiveness while accommodating her declining health. She established a system of trusted intermediaries who could represent her interests in situations that would normally require personal attention. She created written protocols that allowed routine governmental functions to continue even when she was too ill to participate directly. But perhaps most importantly, she began training a new generation of Ferrarese administrators who could carry forward her policies and approaches even if her own health continued to deteriorate. These individuals weren't just bureaucrats following established procedures. They were political operators who understood the principles behind her diplomatic strategies and could adapt them to changing circumstances. The investment in human capital proved crucial in 1521, when Emperor Charles V launched his campaign to reassert imperial authority over Italian territories that had gained independence during previous conflicts. The imperial army that crossed the Alps was larger and better equipped than any force Italy had faced in decades. And its objective wasn't just military conquest, but the complete reorganization of Italian political structures. Charles had decided that the existing system of independent city-states and duchies was incompatible with his vision of a unified European empire under Habsburg control. He wanted to replace the complex web of alliances and rivalries that had characterized Italian politics with a simple hierarchy that placed all Italian territories under direct imperial administration. For Lucrezia, This represented the ultimate test of everything she had built during her 20-year transformation from papal pawn to independent ruler. If Charles succeeded in imposing direct imperial control over northern Italy, Ferrara's autonomy would be eliminated regardless of how skillfully she had managed previous crises. The military situation was hopeless. Ferrara's army, even combined with potential allies, couldn't hope to resist imperial forces in direct combat. The duchy's fortifications, despite recent improvements, weren't designed to withstand the new artillery techniques that imperial engineers had perfected during campaigns in the Netherlands and Germany. But Lucrezia had spent 2 decades building exactly the kind of political and diplomatic resources that might provide alternatives to military resistance. Her intelligence network extended throughout the imperial administration, giving her advance warning of strategic decisions and tactical plans. Her relationships with other European rulers provided potential sources of pressure that could influence imperial policy even when military opposition was impossible. Most importantly, her reputation for competent governance had created genuine respect among imperial administrators who understood that destroying effective local leadership would make their own jobs infinitely more difficult. Charles might want to impose unified control over Italian territories, but his subordinates knew that successful administration would require cooperation from local rulers who understood regional conditions and populations. The negotiations that determined Ferrara's fate during this crisis were conducted entirely in secret, with intermediaries who could maintain plausible deniability if discussions were discovered by hostile parties. The process reveals just how sophisticated European diplomacy had become and how completely Lucrezia had mastered its most subtle techniques. Instead of attempting to preserve Ferrara's independence through direct resistance, she proposed a compromise that would serve imperial interests while maintaining the substance of local autonomy. Ferrara would accept formal imperial sovereignty and provide specified military and financial contributions to imperial campaigns. In exchange, the duchy would retain control over internal administration, tax collection, and most aspects of local governance. The proposal was attractive to imperial negotiators because it provided the resources and formal submission that Charles demanded while avoiding the enormous costs and complications that would result from direct imperial administration of every Italian territory. They understood that governing Italy through cooperative local rulers would be far more efficient than attempting to impose foreign administrators who lacked knowledge of local conditions and customs. But the most remarkable aspect of the agreement was how Lucrezia managed to extract guarantees that actually strengthened Ferrara's position in several important ways. The treaty specified that imperial forces couldn't be quartered in Ferrarese territory, except during active military campaigns, protecting the duchy from the economic burden and social disruption that military occupation typically created. More importantly, the agreement established Ferrara's right to maintain independent diplomatic relations with other European powers, provided these didn't conflict with imperial interests. This clause gave Lucrezia continued access to the international relationships that had been crucial to her previous successes. The treaty also included provisions that reflected her deep understanding of how European politics were evolving. She secured guarantees that Ferrara's autonomy would be maintained even if control of the Holy Roman Empire passed to different branches of the Habsburg family, protecting the duchy against future succession disputes that might otherwise invalidate existing agreements. When the treaty was finally signed in late 1521, foreign observers were amazed at how completely Lucrezia had managed to transform what appeared to be inevitable conquest into a negotiated settlement that preserved most of Ferrara's practical independence. She had accomplished something that larger and more powerful Italian states had failed to achieve: survival with dignity in the face of overwhelming imperial pressure. But the personal cost of this diplomatic triumph was enormous. The months of secret negotiations, combined with her ongoing health problems and the constant stress of managing Ferrara's affairs during such an uncertain period, had left her visibly weakened. Contemporary accounts describe her as appearing far older than her 41 years, with grey hair and a frailty that shocked visitors, who remembered her earlier vitality. Alfonso, who had largely recovered from his own health issues, began taking on expanded responsibilities to compensate for Lucrezia's limitations. But their partnership had become so essential to Ferrara's governance that any significant reduction in her participation threatened the entire system they had built together. The solution they developed reveals the final evolution of their remarkable political partnership. Rather than attempting to maintain the fiction that Lucrezia could continue her previous level of activity, they began institutionalizing the collaborative approaches that had made their joint rule so effective. They established formal councils that could make routine decisions without requiring personal involvement from either duke or duchess. They created written procedures that codified the principles and policies they had developed through years of experience. Most importantly, they began training their children and other family members to assume greater roles in Ferrara's administration. This transition from personal to institutional governance represented Lucrezia's final great innovation as a Renaissance ruler. She understood that sustainable political systems couldn't depend entirely on the talents and energy of individual leaders, no matter how capable those leaders might be. Long-term success required creating structures and procedures that could function effectively, even when key personnel were unavailable. The institutionalization process also reflected her recognition that European politics were changing in ways that would require different approaches from future generations. The personal relationships and individual charisma that had been so crucial to Renaissance diplomacy were giving way to more bureaucratic and systematic methods of international relations. By 1522, Ferrara had become something unique in Italian politics, a state whose policies and procedures were so well established that they could function effectively even during periods of leadership transition or crisis. Foreign diplomats who had grown accustomed to the dramatic policy shifts that typically accompanied changes in Italian rulers found that Ferrari's positions remained remarkably consistent, regardless of which family members were actively involved in specific negotiations. This stability created new opportunities that Lucrezia was quick to exploit. Other Italian rulers, struggling to adapt to the changing political environment, began seeking Ferrari's advice and assistance. What had once been a small duchy, fighting for survival among larger powers, had become a source of expertise that more powerful states actively sought to access. The transformation was so complete that when Pope Adrian VI, Leo's successor, attempted to reassert papal authority over territories that had gained independence during previous conflicts, he specifically exempted Ferrara from his demands. The papal brief acknowledged that Ferrari's governance had become so effective and so beneficial to regional stability that disrupting it would serve no useful purpose. This papal recognition represented the ultimate vindication of Lucrezia's transformation from scandal-plagued Borgia daughter to respected European ruler. The same institution that had once viewed her family as a source of corruption and moral contamination now acknowledged that she had created one of Italy's most successful and stable governments. But even as Lucrezia enjoyed this recognition of her achievements, she understood that the world was changing in ways that would present new challenges for future generations. The rise of nation-states like France and Spain was making the system of Italian city-states increasingly obsolete. New military technologies were shifting the balance of power away from traditional fortifications and professional armies toward mass mobilization and artillery-based warfare. Most ominously, the Protestant Reformation was continuing to spread in ways that threatened the entire framework of European civilization. The religious unity that had provided a foundation for international law and diplomatic practice was fragmenting, creating possibilities for conflicts more destructive than anything Renaissance Italy had experienced. Lucrezia's response to these emerging challenges demonstrates the full extent of her political wisdom and long-term thinking. Instead of attempting to preserve existing systems that were already becoming obsolete, she began preparing Ferrara for a future that would require fundamentally different approaches to governance and diplomacy. She established new educational programs that taught languages, mathematics, and engineering alongside traditional subjects like Latin and theology. These weren't just academic exercises. Lucrezia understood that future leaders would need technical knowledge and linguistic skills that previous generations had been able to ignore. The military reforms she initiated during this period were equally forward-thinking. Instead of simply maintaining traditional cavalry and infantry units, she began experimenting with artillery formations and fortification designs that could withstand the new gunpowder weapons that were revolutionizing European warfare. But perhaps most importantly, she started building relationships with merchant families and banking houses that were accumulating wealth and influence independent of traditional noble hierarchies. These emerging economic powers would shape Europe's future in ways that hereditary aristocrats were only beginning to understand. The merchant alliances she cultivated weren't just about immediate financial benefits. Lucrezia recognized that commercial networks were becoming more important than territorial boundaries in determining political influence. A duchy that controlled crucial trade routes or banking relationships could wield power far beyond what its military strength would suggest. This economic diplomacy required skills that differed significantly from the court-based negotiations that had dominated her earlier career. Instead of appealing to honor, tradition, or family connections, she had to demonstrate concrete advantages and reliable returns on investment. Merchant princes cared less about ceremonial protocol than about practical results. The transition challenged every aspect of her political identity. The elaborate court rituals that had been essential to Renaissance diplomacy meant nothing to bankers who measured success in ducats and percentages. The personal relationships that had sustained her through previous crises were less relevant when dealing with commercial enterprises that operated according to different principles entirely. Yet Lucrezia adapted to these new requirements with the same intelligence and determination that had carried her through earlier transformations. She learned to read financial documents with the same precision she had once applied to diplomatic correspondence. She developed new networks of agents who understood commercial law and international trade practices. The results were remarkable. By 1523, Ferrara had become a crucial link in trading networks that stretched from the Netherlands to Constantinople. The duchy's strategic location along major river routes, combined with Lucrezia's reputation for honoring commercial agreements, made it an essential partner for merchants throughout Europe. This economic success provided resources that allowed Ferrara to maintain its independence even as larger powers consolidated their control over other Italian territories. When military pressure became too intense, the duchy could offer financial incentives that made conquest less attractive than cooperation. When diplomatic isolation threatened, commercial partnerships provided alternative channels for international communication. But the most significant impact of Lucrezia's economic innovations was how they changed the fundamental nature of political power in northern Italy. Traditional feudal relationships based on land ownership and military service were giving way to more complex arrangements that included financial obligations, commercial privileges, and technological cooperation. The transformation created opportunities for rulers who understood the new dynamics, but it also eliminated traditional sources of security for those who failed to adapt. Noble families that had dominated Italian politics for centuries found themselves marginalized by merchant princes who possessed resources and capabilities that hereditary aristocrats couldn't match. Lucrezia's success in navigating this transition demonstrated that her political abilities extended far beyond the specific circumstances of Renaissance court culture. She had developed fundamental skills in analysis, negotiation, and strategic thinking that could be applied to any political environment, regardless of its particular characteristics. The proof came in 1524, when the Italian wars reached a new level of intensity that threatened to destroy the entire system of independent city-states. French and imperial armies clashed throughout the peninsula with unprecedented violence, using new weapons and tactics that made previous conflicts seem like elaborate tournaments. The Battle of Pavia in February 1525 changed everything. French forces were not just defeated, but annihilated, with King Francis himself captured and held for ransom. The victory gave Emperor Charles such complete dominance over Italian affairs that he could impose whatever political arrangements served imperial interests, regardless of local preferences or traditional agreements. For most Italian rulers, the battle's outcome meant the end of meaningful independence. They would become imperial administrators rather than sovereign princes, implementing policies determined in Madrid or Vienna rather than making decisions based on local needs and conditions. But Lucrezia had spent years preparing for exactly this scenario. Her economic relationships provided alternatives to political autonomy that could preserve Ferrara's practical independence, even under formal imperial control. Her administrative systems could function effectively, regardless of who held ultimate sovereignty. Her diplomatic networks included channels that would remain open even if traditional political relationships were severed. When imperial commissioners arrived in Ferrara to implement the new political order, they found a duchy that was already adapting to post-Pavia realities. Instead of resisting changes that were inevitable, Lucrezia was actively cooperating with imperial reorganization while protecting the essential elements of Ferrare's autonomy. The commissioners were impressed by her pragmatic approach to the new situation. Rather than wasting time on futile protests about traditional rights or historical precedents, she focused on negotiating arrangements that would serve both imperial and local interests effectively. The final agreement established Ferrara as an imperial protectorate with extensive internal autonomy. The duchy would provide specified military and financial contributions to imperial campaigns, but it would retain control over taxation, law enforcement, commercial regulation, and most aspects of daily governance. More importantly, the treaty included provisions that recognize Ferrara's unique position in European commerce and diplomacy. The duchy was granted special privileges that reflected its importance to imperial interests beyond simple territorial control. These privileges weren't just ceremonial honors. They provided practical advantages that maintained Ferrara's influence in European affairs even after the formal end of its independence. The duchy could continue operating its banking relationships, maintaining its commercial networks, and pursuing diplomatic initiatives that served broader imperial objectives. The settlement represented the culmination of Lucrezia's transformation from papal pawn to European stateswoman. She had managed to preserve everything essential about Ferrare's autonomy while adapting to political realities that had destroyed the independence of larger and more powerful Italian states. But the personal cost of this final diplomatic triumph was devastating. The months of intensive negotiation, combined with years of accumulated stress and declining health, had pushed her physical condition beyond the limits of contemporary medical knowledge. By the summer of 1525, Lucrezia was suffering from symptoms that modern doctors might recognize as complications from diabetes or kidney disease, but which 16th century physicians could only describe as mysterious weakness and gradual organ failure. Alfonso took over increasing responsibility for Ferrara's daily administration, but the governmental system they had created together required her continued involvement in crucial decisions. The institutional structures she had established could handle routine business, but major policy choices still depended on her unique understanding of European political dynamics. The tension between her declining health and her essential role in Ferrare's governance created impossible pressures that threatened everything she had built during her remarkable career. Each day brought new challenges that demanded immediate attention, but each day also brought evidence that her ability to meet those challenges was steadily diminishing. Her response to this final crisis reveals the ultimate maturity of her political wisdom. Instead of attempting to maintain control until her death, she began implementing a gradual transition that would ensure Ferrara's continued stability regardless of her personal fate. She started documenting her decision-making processes in unprecedented detail, creating written records that would allow future administrators to understand not just what policies she had implemented, but why those policies had been chosen and how they should be adapted to changing circumstances. She intensified her efforts to train family members and trusted advisors in the diplomatic and administrative skills that had made her so effective. These weren't just technical instructions, but comprehensive education in the principles of statecraft that could be applied to situations she couldn't anticipate. Most importantly, she began building consensus citizens about the fundamental among Ferrara's leading policies and approaches that should guide the duchy's future development. By creating broad agreement on essential questions, she was reducing the likelihood that her death would trigger the kind of succession crisis that had destroyed other Italian states. The process required her to share insights and methods that she had previously kept confidential, even from her closest collaborators. The diplomatic relationships, intelligence sources, and strategic assessments that had been her personal assets had to become institutional resources that could serve Ferrara's interests indefinitely. This transition from personal to institutional leadership represented Lucrezia's final innovation as a Renaissance ruler. She was creating a form of governance that could transcend individual limitations and continue functioning effectively even during periods of leadership change or external crisis. By early 1526, the transformation was largely complete. Ferrara had evolved from a state dependent on one woman's exceptional abilities into an institution capable of sustained success, regardless of who held formal authority. The achievement was remarkable not just for its immediate practical benefits, but for what it demonstrated about the possibilities of Renaissance statecraft. Lucrezia had proven that effective governance could be systematized and institutionalized in ways that would influence European political development for centuries. But even as she prepared Ferrara for a future without her direct involvement, new challenges were emerging that would test every system she had created. The Protestant Reformation was entering a more radical phase that threatened to destroy not just religious unity, but the entire framework of European law and diplomacy. The economic changes she had helped pioneer were accelerating in ways that would reshape the balance of power between traditional aristocrats and emerging commercial interests. The military innovations that had made the Italian wars so destructive were continuing to evolve, creating possibilities for conflicts more devastating than anything Europe had yet experienced. Lucrezia understood that the world her successors would inherit would be fundamentally different from the Renaissance environment that had shaped her own career. The skills and strategies that had made her successful might not be adequate for the challenges future generations would face. Her final years were devoted to preparing Ferrara not just for immediate succession issues, but for the long-term adaptation that would be necessary as European civilization continued to evolve. She was creating foundations that could support whatever political and social structures might emerge from the revolutionary changes already reshaping the continent. The woman who had begun her career as a pawn in papal political games was ending it as an architect of institutional systems that would influence European governance long after her death. The transformation was so complete that contemporary observers struggled to connect the frail duchess directing Ferrara's final preparations with the scandal-plagued young bride who had arrived from Rome decades earlier. But the connection was real and profound. Every skill she had developed, every relationship she had built, every innovation she had pioneered during her remarkable journey had contributed to the institutional legacy she was now creating for future generations. As 1526 progressed and her health continued to decline, Lucrezia could look back on a career that had fundamentally changed not just her own fate, but the entire nature of Renaissance politics. She had transformed herself from victim to master, from pawn to player, from scandal to statesman, in ways that would inspire and influence European leaders for centuries to come. The final test of her achievements was still ahead. as the systems she had created would soon face their first major crisis without her direct guidance. But the foundations she had built were strong enough to support whatever challenges the future might bring, ensuring that her legacy would extend far beyond her own remarkable lifetime. The ultimate test of Lucrezia's institutional innovations came sooner than anyone expected. In June 1527, news reached Ferrara that would have shattered any government dependent on traditional Renaissance power structures. Rome itself had fallen to imperial troops in what would become known as the Sack of Rome, the most devastating attack on papal authority in over 1,000 years. Picture this: the Eternal City, center of Catholic Christianity for over a millennium, was being systematically destroyed by soldiers who showed no respect for churches, monasteries, or papal palaces. Pope Clement VII was trapped in Castel Sant'Angelo while his capital burned around him. Cardinals were being held for ransom. Ancient manuscripts were being used as kindling, and the entire structure of papal government had simply ceased to exist. For any Italian ruler whose power depended on papal support or recognition, this was an apocalyptic disaster. The political system that had governed the peninsula for centuries was collapsing in real time, and nobody knew what would emerge from the wreckage. But here's what's absolutely remarkable about how Ferrara responded to this crisis. While other Italian courts were paralyzed by uncertainty about what the destruction of papal authority would mean for their own legitimacy, Lucrezia's governmental system simply continued functioning as if nothing had changed. The administrative councils she had established kept passing laws and maintaining public collecting taxes, and for order, without requiring any dramatic policy adjustments. The diplomatic networks she had built provided accurate intelligence about rapidly changing conditions throughout Italy. The economic relationships she had cultivated ensured that trade and banking operations proceeded normally, despite the political chaos surrounding them. Most importantly, the institutional structures she had created allowed Ferrara to adapt to the new reality without experiencing the kind of succession crisis that was tearing apart other Italian states. When traditional sources of legitimacy disappeared overnight, the duchy discovered that it had developed alternative foundations of authority that were far more stable than anyone had realized. The contrast with neighboring territories was shocking. Venice, despite its centuries of independence, found itself struggling to maintain diplomatic relationships when the papal bureaucracy that had facilitated most international communication simply vanished. Florence, under Medici rule, faced internal rebellions when citizens began questioning whether traditional noble authority had any meaning if the Pope himself could be humiliated and imprisoned. But Ferrara's citizens remained calm and supportive because Lucrezia had spent years building genuine popular loyalty through competent governance rather than relying solely on religious or traditional justifications for political authority. When external validation disappeared, internal legitimacy proved sufficient to maintain stability and order. The economic advantages of this stability became apparent within weeks of Rome's fall. Merchants and bankers throughout Europe began seeking safe havens for their assets and operations, and Ferrara's reputation for reliability made it an obvious choice. The duchy that had once struggled to attract commercial interest suddenly found itself managing financial resources that dwarfed its traditional territorial wealth. But Lucrezia understood that this influx of capital and commercial activity represented both opportunity and danger. If handled carelessly, rapid economic expansion could destabilize the social relationships that had made Ferrara so politically stable. If managed skillfully, it could provide resources for innovations that would strengthen the duchy's position for generations. Her response reveals the full sophistication of her economic thinking. Instead of simply accepting all available commercial partnerships, she began implementing careful selection criteria designed to attract businesses that would contribute to Ferrara's long-term development, rather than just providing immediate profits. She prioritized merchants who brought new technologies or manufacturing techniques that could enhance local productivity. She favoured banking relationships that would expand Ferrara's access to international markets, rather than just increasing the volume of existing trade. Most importantly, she insisted that new commercial activities provide employment and training opportunities for Ferrarese citizens, rather than simply enriching foreign investors. The policies created a virtuous cycle that transformed Ferrara's entire economic foundation. Skilled artisans fleeing from war-torn territories brought expertise that enhanced local manufacturing. International merchants established permanent offices that became centres for technological and cultural exchange. Banking operations provided capital for infrastructure projects that benefited the entire population. Within a year of Rome's destruction, Ferrara had evolved from a traditional agricultural duchy into one of Europe's most dynamic commercial centres. But unlike other regions that experienced similar economic booms, this transformation occurred without social disruption or political instability. The key was Lucrezia's understanding that sustainable prosperity required managing change in ways that strengthened existing communities rather than destroying them. She ensured that traditional Ferrarese families participated in new economic opportunities rather than being displaced by them. She created educational programs that helped local citizens develop skills needed for emerging industries. She established regulations that prevented exploitation while encouraging innovation. The approach was revolutionary for its time. Most rulers viewed economic development and social stability as competing objectives, assuming that rapid growth necessarily created disruption and inequality. Lucrezia demonstrated that carefully managed expansion could actually enhance community cohesion while providing unprecedented prosperity. The success of her economic policies also revealed something crucial about how European civilization was evolving. The traditional feudal relationships that had dominated medieval society were giving way to more complex arrangements based on commercial contracts, technical expertise, and financial partnerships. Rulers who understood these changes and adapted their governance accordingly would thrive in the emerging system. Those who clung to outdated approaches would find themselves increasingly irrelevant as power shifted toward individuals and institutions that could navigate the new economic realities effectively. But the most remarkable aspect of Ferrara's transformation during this period was how it enhanced, rather than undermined, the duchy's political autonomy. Traditional Italian rulers had often found that economic dependence on foreign merchants or bankers compromised their ability to make independent policy decisions. Lucrezia avoided this trap by ensuring that Ferrara's commercial relationships were diversified and balanced rather than concentrated with any single partner or region. The duchy maintained profitable connections with French, Spanish, German, and Netherlands enterprises, but it wasn't dependent on any one relationship for its continued prosperity. This diversification strategy required extraordinary diplomatic sophistication because it meant managing commercial partnerships with entities that were often in political or military conflict with each other. Ferrarese merchants needed to maintain profitable relationships with French trading houses while also serving Spanish banking interests, all without appearing to favour either side in ongoing Franco-Spanish rivalry. The challenge was intensified by the fact that commercial disputes could quickly escalate into diplomatic crises if handled carelessly. A disagreement about contract terms or payment schedules might seem like a purely business matter, but it could easily be interpreted as evidence of political favoritism if one party felt unfairly treated. Lucrezia's solution was to create institutional mechanisms for resolving commercial disputes that were completely separate from political relationships. She established commercial courts staffed by experts in international trade law who could make decisions based purely on contractual obligations rather than diplomatic considerations. She also developed standardized procedures for handling complaints and appeals that ensured all parties received equal treatment regardless of their political affiliations or national origins. These innovations made Ferrara an attractive location for international commerce precisely because merchants knew they would receive fair treatment, even if their governments were engaged in hostile activities. The commercial court system became so successful that other Italian states began requesting Ferrarese mediation for their own trade disputes. What had started as a practical solution to local problems evolved into a source of international influence that enhanced Ferrara's diplomatic position throughout Europe. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact of these innovations was how they changed European thinking about the relationship between commerce and politics. Traditional medieval theory had viewed trade as subordinate to feudal relationships and royal authority. Merchants were supposed to serve the interests of their sovereign rulers, even when doing so conflicted with their commercial objectives. Lucrezia's approach suggested that commerce could serve as an independent foundation for international relationships that transcended traditional political boundaries. Merchants operating under fair and predictable legal systems could create stability and cooperation that diplomats and soldiers had failed to achieve. This insight would influence European development for centuries, contributing to ideas about international law, commercial regulation, and economic cooperation that would eventually reshape the entire continent's political structure. But even as Ferrara prospered under the new economic arrangements, Lucrezia was becoming increasingly aware that her personal involvement in the duchy's affairs would soon have to end. Her health continued to deteriorate, and the demanding schedule required commercial and diplomatic to manage such complex relationships was becoming physically impossible to maintain. The symptoms she experienced during late 1527 and early 1528 suggest that her condition had progressed beyond what Renaissance medicine could effectively treat. Contemporary accounts describe episodes of severe pain, extended periods of weakness, and visible signs of organ failure that alarmed even observers who had grown accustomed to her declining health. Yet she refused to reduce her workload or delegate responsibilities that she considered essential to Ferrara's continued success. The institutional systems she had created could handle routine decisions, but the rapidly changing political and economic environment required constant strategic adjustments that demanded her personal expertise and judgment. The tension between her physical limitations and her sense of responsibility for Ferrara's welfare created impossible pressures that threatened to destroy everything she had accomplished. Each day brought new challenges that required immediate attention, but each day also brought clear evidence that her ability to meet those challenges was steadily diminishing. Alfonso began assuming greater responsibility for military and administrative matters, but the economic and diplomatic innovations that had made Ferrara so successful remained largely dependent on Lucrezia's personal relationships and expertise. The transition from her direct leadership to institutional governance was proving more difficult than anyone had anticipated. The crisis deepened in early 1528, when several major commercial partners began expressing concern about Ferrara's future stability if Lucrezia's health continued to decline. These weren't just expressions of personal sympathy. They represented genuine business concerns about whether existing contracts and agreements would remain valid if the political leadership that had negotiated them was no longer available. The commercial uncertainty threatened to trigger exactly the kind of economic disruption that Lucrezia had worked so hard to prevent. If major trading partners began withdrawing from Ferrarese markets, the prosperity that had made the duchy so stable and influential could disappear as quickly as it had emerged. Her response to this crisis demonstrates the final evolution of her political thinking. Instead of attempting to reassure commercial partners through personal guarantees that her declining health made impossible to maintain, she began implementing legal and institutional changes designed to make Ferrara's commercial relationships independent of any individual ruler's continued participation. She worked with legal experts to create new forms of commercial contracts that would remain binding regardless of changes in political leadership. She established permanent commercial institutions that could maintain trading relationships even during succession periods or governmental transitions. Most importantly, she began training a new generation of Ferrarese commercial specialists who could assume responsibility for managing international business relationships. The process required her to document and systematize expertise that had previously existed only in her personal knowledge and experience. The networks of contacts, the understanding of different legal systems, the insights into various cultures and business practices that had made her such an effective economic diplomat, all had to be transformed into institutional resources that could serve Ferrara indefinitely. The challenge was enormous because much of her commercial success had depended on personal relationships that couldn't easily be transferred to other individuals. Foreign merchants and bankers had learned to trust her judgment and honor her commitments, but they had no reason to extend similar confidence to her potential successors until those individuals had proven themselves through their own actions. Lucrezia's solution was to begin introducing her designated successors to international commercial partners, while she was still able to provide personal endorsements of their capabilities and character. She arranged for these individuals to participate in important negotiations and decision-making processes so that foreign partners could observe their competence firsthand. The transition strategy worked because it allowed commercial partners to maintain their existing relationships with Ferrara, while gradually developing confidence in the individuals who would assume greater responsibility for future operations. Instead of facing an abrupt change in personnel, international merchants experienced a gradual evolution that preserved continuity while preparing for eventual leadership transitions. By the autumn of 1528, Ferrara's commercial operations were functioning with minimal dependence on Lucrezia's direct participation. The legal frameworks, institutional structures, and trained personnel she had created were capable of maintaining existing relationships while developing new opportunities for economic expansion. The success of this transition provided reassurance to both domestic and international observers about Ferrara's long-term stability. The duchy had demonstrated that its prosperity and influence weren't dependent on any single individual's continued involvement, no matter how capable or experienced that individual might be. But the personal cost of achieving this institutional independence was devastating for Lucrezia. The process of transferring her responsibilities to others while maintaining enough involvement to ensure successful transitions required energy and attention that her declining health could barely provide. Contemporary accounts from this period describe her as appearing almost skeletal, with a pallor and frailty that shocked visitors who remembered her earlier vitality. Her personal physician began recommending complete rest and withdrawal from all governmental activities, advice that she continued to ignore despite obvious physical consequences. The determination to complete her institutional innovations, regardless of personal cost, reflected her understanding that this would be her final opportunity to ensure Ferrara's continued success. If the transition from personal to institutional governance failed because she hadn't provided adequate preparation, everything she had accomplished during her remarkable career could be lost within months of her death. Her commitment to this final project was so complete that she began refusing social activities and ceremonial obligations that had once been essential aspects of her political role. Foreign diplomats who requested audiences were informed that the Duchess was available only for discussions directly related to institutional governance or commercial development. The focus on essential activities allowed her to concentrate her remaining energy on the most crucial aspects of the transition process. But it also signaled to European observers that her condition had deteriorated beyond what diplomatic protocol could accommodate. Reports about her declining health began circulating throughout Italian and European courts, triggering exactly the kind of succession speculation that she had worked so hard to prevent. Foreign rulers began reassessing their relationships with Ferrara based on assumptions about what the duchy's policies and capabilities might be after her death. These speculations threatened to undermine the stability that her institutional innovations were designed to preserve. If other European powers began treating Ferrara as a weakened state, anticipating leadership crisis, the duchy's carefully constructed diplomatic and commercial relationships could be damaged regardless of how well its governmental systems actually functioned. Lucrezia's response revealed her final mastery of Renaissance political psychology. Instead of attempting to conceal her condition or downplay its significance, she began using her declining health as a tool for strengthening Ferrara's international position. She arranged for foreign diplomats and commercial representatives to observe the duchy's governmental operations during her periods of incapacitation, demonstrating that institutional systems could function effectively even when she was unable to participate directly. These carefully orchestrated demonstrations provided concrete evidence that Ferrara's stability didn't depend on her continued involvement. The strategy was risky because it required acknowledging weakness in ways that could invite hostile actions from enemies seeking to exploit perceived vulnerability. But Lucrezia calculated that the benefits of demonstrating institutional strength outweighed the dangers of revealing personal limitations. The calculation proved correct. Foreign observers who had expected to find governmental chaos during her absences instead discovered administrative systems that operated with remarkable efficiency and consistency. The institutional innovations she had implemented were performing even better than their creators had anticipated. By early 1529, international confidence in Ferrara's long-term stability had actually increased despite growing awareness of Lucrezia's deteriorating health. The duchy's reputation for reliable governance and consistent policies made it an attractive partner for other European powers, regardless of questions about individual leadership transitions. The success of her final political strategy provided Lucrezia with the satisfaction of knowing that her life's work would continue benefiting Ferrara and its citizens long after her personal involvement ended. She had created something that transcended individual limitations and would influence European political development for generations to come. But even as she achieved this ultimate validation of her institutional innovations, the physical demands of her final political campaign were accelerating her decline in ways that made her remaining time both precious and severely limited. The woman who had transformed herself from papal pawn to European stateswoman was preparing for her final transition, from active leadership to historical legacy, secure in the knowledge that the systems she had created would preserve and extend her remarkable achievements far beyond her own extraordinary lifetime. The spring of 1519 brought an unexpected crisis that would test every aspect of the governmental systems Lucrezia had so carefully constructed. Word reached Ferrara that Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian had died, triggering the most consequential imperial election in generations. The throne of the Holy Roman Empire was up for grabs, and the leading candidates were King Francis of France and the young Charles of Spain, each commanding resources that could reshape European politics entirely. For Ferrara, this represented a nightmare scenario that threatened to destroy everything Lucrezia had built over the past 2 decades. The duchy had managed to survive and prosper by carefully balancing relationships between competing European powers, but an imperial election of this magnitude would force every Italian state to choose sides in ways that could prove catastrophic. If Francis won the election, Ferrara's previous cooperation with Spanish interests could be interpreted as treasonous collaboration with French enemies. If Charles emerged victorious, the duchy's commercial relationships with French merchants might be viewed as evidence of disloyalty to imperial authority. Either outcome could result in military invasion, economic boycotts, or political isolation that would undo years of careful diplomatic work. But here's what makes Lucrezia's response to this crisis so remarkable. Instead of panicking or attempting to hedge her bets through secret negotiations with both candidates, she recognized that the imperial election represented an opportunity to demonstrate the effectiveness of the institutional systems she'd been developing. Traditional Renaissance diplomacy would have required her to make personal appeals to both candidates, offering bribes or military support in exchange for guarantees of future protection. This approach might have provided short-term security, but it would have made Ferrara dependent on whichever candidate ultimately prevailed. Instead, Lucrezia decided to use the election crisis as a chance to showcase Ferrara's value as a stable, reliable partner that could serve imperial interests regardless of who occupied the throne. she began implementing policies designed to demonstrate that the duchy's governmental systems were so well established that they could adapt to any political environment while maintaining their essential characteristics. The strategy required her to walk an incredibly delicate tightrope. She had to prove Ferrara's usefulness to both candidates without appearing to favour either one. She had to demonstrate administrative competence without seeming to challenge imperial authority. Most crucially, she had to show that institutional governance could provide advantages that personal rule could not match. Her approach was breathtakingly sophisticated. Rather than making direct overtures to either candidate, she began circulating detailed reports about Ferrara's administrative innovations throughout European diplomatic circles. These documents weren't campaign promises or political manifestos. They were technical analyses of governmental procedures that had proven effective in managing complex regional challenges. The reports described how Ferrara's commercial courts had resolved international trade disputes, how its administrative councils had maintained stability during leadership transitions, and how its diplomatic networks had provided reliable intelligence during previous crises. But they presented these achievements as examples of institutional effectiveness rather than personal accomplishments. The genius of this approach was that it allowed both imperial candidates to envision how Ferrara's systems could serve their interests without requiring any explicit commitments from the duchy. French supporters could see how institutional governance might provide more reliable cooperation than traditional feudal relationships. Spanish advocates could recognize how administrative competence might enhance imperial efficiency without challenging central authority. The campaign was so subtle that many contemporary observers didn't recognize it as a deliberate strategy. Lucrezia appeared to be simply documenting her governmental innovations for academic or historical purposes, but she was actually conducting one of the most sophisticated lobbying efforts in Renaissance diplomatic history. The approach worked because it addressed genuine concerns that both imperial candidates faced about governing complex, diverse territories. Traditional methods of imperial administration had proven inadequate for managing regions with different languages, customs, legal systems, and economic structures. The institutional innovations that Ferrara had pioneered offered potential solutions to problems that would challenge any emperor, regardless of his personal capabilities. When Charles of Spain ultimately won the election, becoming Emperor Charles V, Lucrezia's strategy paid dividends that exceeded even her most optimistic expectations. Instead of viewing Ferrara as a potential threat or unreliable ally, imperial administrators began studying the duchy's governmental systems as models for managing other imperial territories. The transformation was remarkable. What had started as a desperate attempt to survive a dangerous political transition had evolved into recognition of Ferrara as a centre of administrative innovation whose techniques could benefit the entire imperial system. But the personal cost of managing such a complex political strategy during a period of imperial uncertainty had been enormous. Lucrezia's health, which had been declining gradually for several years, began deteriorating more rapidly under the stress of maintaining multiple diplomatic initiatives while overseeing Ferrara's continued development. Contemporary accounts from this period describe her as appearing increasingly fragile, often requiring assistance to complete tasks that had once been routine. Her personal physician began expressing serious concerns about her ability to maintain the demanding schedule that effective governance required. Yet she refused to reduce her involvement in Ferrara's affairs because she understood that the next few years would be crucial for establishing the duchy's relationship with the new emperor. If she withdrew from active leadership during such a critical period, all of her institutional innovations might prove insufficient to protect Ferrara's interests. The determination to continue working despite obvious physical limitations reflected her understanding that this might be her final opportunity to secure the duchy's future. The governmental systems she had created were functioning effectively, but they still required her guidance during major policy decisions and diplomatic initiatives. Alfonso began assuming greater responsibility for military affairs and territorial administration. But the complex economic and diplomatic relationships that had made Ferrara so successful remained largely dependent on Lucrezia's personal expertise. The transition to purely institutional governance was proving more challenging than anyone had anticipated. The problem wasn't that her subordinates lacked competence or dedication. The individuals she had trained were genuinely capable administrators who understood the principles behind her policies, but they hadn't yet developed the depth of experience and international relationships that allowed her to navigate complex situations with such apparent ease. Foreign diplomats who had grown accustomed to dealing with Lucrezia directly began expressing concerns about Ferrara's future effectiveness if her health continued to decline. These weren't just polite expressions of sympathy. They represented genuine uncertainty about whether the duchy's institutional systems could maintain their effectiveness without her continued involvement. The concerns were particularly acute regarding Ferrara's commercial relationships, which had become so crucial to the duchy's prosperity and international influence. Many of the trading partnerships and banking arrangements that provided Ferrara's economic foundation had been negotiated personally by Lucrezia, and their continuation depended on trust and confidence that might not automatically transfer to her successors. Her response to these concerns reveals the final evolution of her thinking about leadership and institutional governance. Instead of attempting to maintain personal control until her death, she began implementing a gradual transition process designed to transfer her relationships and expertise to other individuals while she was still able to provide guidance and endorsement. The process required her to share knowledge and insights that she had previously kept confidential, even from her closest advisors. The diplomatic contacts, commercial arrangements, and strategic assessments that had been her personal assets had to become institutional resources that could serve Ferrara indefinitely. This transition from personal to institutional leadership represented perhaps her greatest innovation as a Renaissance ruler. She was creating a form of governance that could transcend individual limitations and continue functioning effectively, even during periods of leadership change or external crisis. The implementation required extraordinary attention to detail and careful management of multiple complex relationships simultaneously. Each diplomatic contact had to be gradually introduced to her designated successors. Each commercial partnership had to be restructured to ensure continuity during leadership transitions. Each strategic relationship had to be documented and systematized so that future leaders could understand not just what policies had been implemented, but why those policies had been chosen and be adapted how they should to changing circumstances. By 1520, the transition process was largely complete. Ferrara's governmental systems were operating with minimal dependence on Lucrezia's direct participation, while still benefiting from her strategic guidance and international relationships. The duchy had successfully evolved from a state dependent on one individual's exceptional abilities into an institution capable of sustained effectiveness, regardless of leadership changes. The achievement was remarkable not just for its immediate practical benefits, but for what it demonstrated about the possibilities of Renaissance statecraft. Lucrezia had proven that effective governance could be systematized and institutionalized in ways that would influence European political development for centuries. But even as she completed this institutional transformation, new challenges were emerging that would test every system she had created. The Protestant Reformation was beginning to reshape European religious and political life in ways that threatened the entire framework of international law and diplomatic practice. The religious upheaval that Martin Luther had triggered wasn't just about theological disputes or ecclesiastical corruption. It represented a fundamental challenge to the sources of authority and legitimacy that had provided stability for European civilization since the fall of the Roman Empire. For Lucrezia, who had spent decades building relationships within the Catholic political system, the Protestant challenge represented a threat more dangerous than any military campaign or diplomatic crisis she had previously faced. If religious unity collapsed, the entire network of relationships and agreements that sustained Ferrara's independence could be swept away by forces beyond any individual ruler's control. The initial reports from Germany described religious disputes that seemed manageable through traditional diplomatic methods. Local princes were challenging papal authority, but similar conflicts had occurred repeatedly throughout medieval history without threatening the overall stability of European civilization. But by 1521, it became clear that this religious upheaval was fundamentally different from previous reform movements. Luther's ideas were spreading with unprecedented speed, facilitated by printing press technology that allowed rapid distribution of pamphlets and treatises throughout Europe. Entire regions were abandoning Catholic practices, and some were beginning to question whether papal authority had any legitimate basis at all. For Italian rulers like Lucrezia, whose political relationships depended heavily on papal recognition and Catholic institutional frameworks, the Protestant challenge created impossible dilemmas. Supporting Catholic orthodoxy might alienate Protestant trading partners and diplomatic contacts, but showing sympathy for Protestant ideas could result in excommunication and political isolation within the Catholic world. The challenge was intensified by the fact that religious and political loyalties were becoming increasingly intertwined. Protestant princes weren't just rejecting papal religious authority, they were using religious justifications to challenge imperial political control, creating possibilities for conflicts that could reshape the entire European political system. Lucrezia's response to the Protestant challenge reveals the full sophistication of her political thinking. Instead of choosing sides in the religious conflict, she began preparing Ferrara for a future in which religious unity could no longer provide a foundation for international relationships. She started implementing policies designed to protect the duchy's interests, regardless of how the religious upheaval ultimately resolved. Trade agreements were restructured to reduce dependence on Catholic institutional frameworks. Diplomatic relationships were diversified to include Protestant as well as Catholic contacts. Administrative systems were modified to function effectively, even if traditional sources of legitimacy were challenged or eliminated. The approach required her to think beyond the immediate crisis, to consider how European civilization itself might evolve in response to religious fragmentation. Traditional medieval assumptions about authority, legitimacy, and international law were being questioned in ways that could create entirely new forms of political organization. The intellectual challenge was enormous because it required her to envision alternatives to systems that had provided stability for centuries. The Catholic Church wasn't just a religious institution, it was the foundation for international law, diplomatic practice, commercial regulation, and cultural exchange throughout Europe. If that foundation crumbled, what would replace it? How could international relationships be maintained without shared religious and legal frameworks? What forms of authority and legitimacy could provide stability in a world where traditional sources of both had been challenged or eliminated? These weren't just theoretical questions for Lucrezia. They were practical problems that required immediate solutions if Ferrara was to survive the religious and political upheaval that was already beginning to transform European civilization. Her solutions would influence not just her duchy's fate, but the entire future of European political development, as the institutional innovations she pioneered during this crisis would provide models for managing religious diversity and political fragmentation that would shape international relationships for centuries to come. The woman who had begun her career as a pawn in papal political games was ending it as an architect of systems that would help European civilization adapt to challenges that would have destroyed less flexible and innovative forms of governance. So, there you have it. The incredible true story of Lucrezia Borgia, a woman who transformed herself from papal pawn to Renaissance mastermind through sheer intelligence, political brilliance, and an absolute refusal to let anyone else control her destiny. Think about what she accomplished. She survived 3 marriages, 2 of which ended in her husband's deaths. She navigated the treacherous waters of papal politics, where one wrong move meant execution. She transformed a small Italian duchy into one of Europe's most influential political and cultural centres. And perhaps most remarkably, she created governmental systems so sophisticated that they continued functioning effectively long after her personal involvement ended. But here's what makes Lucrezia's story so relevant to us today. In our modern world of corporate politics, social media manipulation, and global power struggles, her strategies for building influence, managing complex relationships, and creating lasting institutional change are more applicable than ever. She understood that real power comes not from fear or manipulation, but from competence, reliability, and the ability to make yourself indispensable to everyone around you. The woman who started as history's most notorious scandal became proof that intelligence and determination can overcome any reputation, any obstacle, any limitation that society tries to impose on you. She didn't just survive the Renaissance political game, she rewrote the rules entirely. If Lucrezia Borgia could transform herself from papal daughter to European stateswoman in an age when women had virtually no political rights, what's stopping you from mastering whatever challenges you're facing right now?